And Tim, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate that a lot. It means a great deal to me to be able to call you a friend as well. I want to introduce myself, though, to you in a little bit of a different way. This is also who I am. Bull Run Farm, Sage's Ravine, Spruce Knob, Dickinson's Reach, Heron's Rip, Moosilauke, Aroon River Valley, Central Harlem, Cedar Mesa, Chama River, Arch Rock, Drake's Beach, Lake Atitlan, Knoll Farm. So that's me. These words, these places, they tell you my story, more than the story that Tim related to you. These are the places, the waters, the food, the wood, the dreams, the memories that literally make up this body in front of you. These places define me. I'm that alchemy of land and people and story, and of course, so are you. This is also my story. I'm the youngest son of a Jewish immigrant who fled the Ukraine and upon arriving in America changed his name and his identity to get a job here. My dad left me with these images of arriving in America. 1930s on the East River in Brooklyn. And also the stories from his childhood of diving off of fishing piers into that East River in Brooklyn, New York. His sense of place is really different from my own. He had Brooklyn's gritty and very polluted East River, and that man gave me Knowles experiences. An outward bound and a love of the wild and the city. I am forever privileged by all that he had to do and did for himself, but for me to make a home here in America so that I might even be able to call myself a conservationist. His legacy makes it impossible for me to think about place with also thinking about place for whom. And when I think about the promise of land conservation, which is why I think I stand with you here this morning for sure, I begin with this one word, querencia. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard about it. It's a really important word. It's a mestizo word, which means it came to us from North Africa originally and then made its way with culture into northern Mexico, southwestern United States. This one word, querencia, was defined for me by the cultural anthropologist Esteban Arellano. He called it the place where the animal lives. He also said that it means the tendency of humans to return to where they were born. He also said it means, and this is where it gets really interesting, he said it means affection and responsibility. It means the place where one feels secure, the place of one's memory. It means the tendency to love and be loved. So this word, and many others like it in so many other different languages, kuleana in Hawaiian, it means both the root of the taro plant, but it also means family and responsibility. All of these connect and suggest that our affection and our responsibility to one another and to community has always been intimately connected to our relationship to place and nature. And querencia doesn't exist for just some people. It doesn't exist for conservationists alone or environmentalists alone. It exists for all people. And querencia is what has made Maine unique, I would offer. Here, a love of land informs your sense of neighborliness and your acceptance of others. Take this in. While across the United States right now, there are nearly twice as many prisoners in our country as there are farmers, Here in Maine, you have 3 times the national percentage of your population that earns some livelihood still from the land. In Maine, you are more connected to that land as loggers, farmers, dairymen, gardeners, naturalists, sugarers, fishers, than almost every other part of the country. And this, I think, contributes mightily to your democratic traditions and your strong sense of community, even though a great many of those folks aren't members of your organizations and might not even call themselves conservationists. I want to offer that we are connected this morning to a great, great diversity of Mainers who love and are defined by this land, and therefore defined by your work. Will Mainers in 2050 be defined as well by this landscape? What will happen to our communities and to our economy here if they are not? And what's the role of conservation today in shaping Maine's culture tomorrow? So there have been many, many who have helped me to understand that fundamental relationship between healthy land and healthy community, healthy people. Early in my career, I was fortunate enough to work as a freelance photographer in Southeast Asia, where I spent 2 years in Nepal, a place where time was counted really in the cycles of the moon and in the passing of seasons of rain and snow. They gave this young American a completely new definition of true wealth. Their currency was rice and one's labor, and their jobs were to feed one another and to stay in relationship with their land and their gods. And wealth was the neighbors who would come when something went wrong. Or my friendship with this man, the Maine homesteader and social critic Bill Copperthwaite. Bill's inspiration for his innovative architecture and principles of democracy and in living come directly from his love of land that has sustained his bold experiment in living. You know, Thoreau went to Walden Pond for 2 years. Bill's lived there on that beautiful piece of land in Machiasport for 50. There are 4 miles of down east coastline and tidal estuary that Bill calls home, and this land and he have gently shaped one another in a relationship that's lasted 3 generations. I've learned from Bill how land is not whole without people, and that people are not whole without the skill and craft of living well in place. Or my alliance, too, and friendship with Classy Parker, a 3rd-generation resident of 121st Street in central Harlem, who turned vacant lots into community gardens, not because she was some professional activist, but because she wanted a place for her parents to grow old and to be out on the land. It was Classy who said to me on the first occasion that I met her, "Peter, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up in my liberation, then we have something to do together." And Classy, perhaps more than any other teacher, helped me to understand that my work in conservation was fundamentally about healing relationships and helping to make whole people, however I could do that, however we could do that. And as a result of living in Guatemala for the past 6 months, I must add the name of Francisco Jimenez, a Catholic priest who died in 1703, but through his singular personal inclusiveness, invited Mayan shaman back into that church, which was built atop their Mayan temple, because Francisco Jimenez knew that their practices were of value. And despite the intervening 500 years of economic oppression and prejudice and civil war, these Mayan shamans receive their God today alongside Christians and continue a spiritual relationship to a specific place on earth, a specific place, for 3,800 years. It gives me such hope to think of how we might endure through the challenges that come. So for me, what connects all of those experiences from Maine to Harlem to Guatemala is that, as Tim said, I've tried really hard to be a good and consistent student of that relationship between people and the land. I've learned that conservation is much more than buying and protecting real estate. It's the epic story of nurturing a healthy relationship between people and then between people and the land. So here are some of the questions that I'm grappling with, and I respectfully ask you to grapple with me. What are we going to face as conservationists in the next 25 years in service to our mission? What will it take to innovate in the way we have in the past? And what today are we for? What are we for? And what kind of leader does that ask us to be? And even as I hear myself pose those questions, they do imply some need for evolution or change. Why? As Tim said, hasn't conservation been enormously successful? I want to offer that it is our success, it is your success which makes change necessary. When conservationists control 4 million acres out of 20, or about 20% of the state of Maine's land mass, as you do right here, it's no longer feasible to say that transportation, poverty, food security, or how your neighbors are going to heat their homes next winter is not your concern. The more you succeed, all those things that you think lie beyond your mission become expected of you. That's what it means to become a respected public citizen. It's the commitment to think about and act upon issues that go beyond your own house. Change is also necessary because the Maine that's emerging now is going to be very different. And you all know this from the Maine of, say, 1970, when the contemporary conservation movement got its start. Maine's racial and ethnic diversity is far bigger and more important than is often visible. And like my home of Vermont, Maine is largely white, but I tell you, we diminish ourselves to say that Maine is not diverse. There are 62,000 people of color in this state. That's twice the population of Washington County. And 94,000 Mainers speak a different language than English at home right now. But it's true that Maine's biggest changes aren't necessarily about big population ingrowth or increases or racial change. They're about how the country's oldest population, yes, that's you, transitions to a younger and less homogeneous population that likely wasn't born here but moved here from away. Take this in. Maine has the oldest median age, the smallest population under 18, and the lowest birth rate in the nation. The only way to maintain a traditional growth economy, and I know there's many of you in this room who probably don't want to maintain that traditional growth economy, but the only way to do that is through some kind of in-migration. So what will happen as more and more different folks move here with higher salaries, urban and suburban values, and perhaps a different knowledge of the land, and certainly different ways of connecting to it? How will you meet them? How will they see you? So these are issues of class and difference that are critically important to the future of Maine. and the future of conservation. It is a very, very exciting time. Let me take just a moment to show you what will simultaneously be going around you across the nation. Here's something of a Harper's Index, if you will, 2012, about biodiversity, health of the land, health of people. 2050, probably most of you have heard that date. That's the date that the International Panel on Climate Change says that every nation has to be carbon neutral, or we don't know. Something's going to happen. Something's already happening. But tie that in with 2042, which statistically speaking is about the same time. 2042, according to our demographers, is when we will have passed a threshold that marks the biggest demographic shift in our country in 150 years. That's the year, statistically speaking, when white Americans will be a minority in the United States. And this is true today in 4 states, Hawaii, Texas, California, and New Mexico. 40% right now of all Americans are under the age of 24 are people of color. You know that diversity thing? Well, it's not a thing. It already happened. All that matters now is how will we adapt? How will we leverage that? How will we join it? 2.53 million, that's the number of Americans who lack access to a supermarket within 5 miles of their house. 15.4%, that's the number of families in Maine who are food insecure. That's actually 200,000 families who lack, according to your government statistics, enough nutrition or access to nutrition for proper, access to enough food for proper nutrition. And 565 acres, that's the rate per hour that land is developed in this country. So over the last decade, I've had the privilege to work closely with about 50 conservation organizations of all ages and sizes and stripes and colors. And the organization that I co-founded has about 750 alumni who are conservation professionals. So this is what I've observed about how conservationists are meeting those issues. Typically, there are 2 camps. And the first tends to understand those demographic shifts internally. And the question that they ask themselves is, all my major donors have white hair, who's going to pay for this work in 10 years? Their practical focus is on time. How can we buy and protect as much land while there's still money and public support to do so? Their innovations are around speed and doing more and staying the course. And their advantage is that their tools and strategies are really well established. And they're doing really good work. The other camp tends to understand the demographics more externally. The kind of question they say to themselves is, frankly, I don't really know who is going to live in this community in 15 years and what they'll need, but we're going to find out. And their practical focus is on community relationships and public education. Their innovations around flexibility and community responsiveness. They lack easily quantified measures of success, and there is no map yet for the terrain they are entering. And of course, there are some groups, some conservation groups, who are successfully doing the work of both camps. And on these topics, I am neither judgmental nor impartial. Every conservation group has the wisdom to decide what's best for them, for their landscape, and for the people they serve. And each camp, if you will, does courageous, important work in service to the land. And the mere presence of these different, camps or visions for what is high-leverage conservation of the future, it makes it pretty evident that we are at a crossroads. We're at a critical moment of transition for our movement as we reconsider how best to help conservation and our communities thrive. I describe this as the shift from conservation 1.0 to 2.0. And this is what I see as our biggest challenge, and I respect that we may not completely agree. And that shows the health of our movement. No conservation organization, even ones as creative and successful as those here this morning, are going to succeed long-term in the mission of conserving land without a broader and deeper engagement of the public. And that American public is experiencing that huge, enormous shift. Given what I've observed, you probably observed in presidential politics of the day, state politics of the day, and what 9 men and women sitting in a Supreme Court can change, I no longer believe that laws alone will sustain conservation. I see the 110,000 protected areas across USA as vulnerable to a culture that increasingly doesn't understand, doesn't relate, perhaps doesn't care, and in the future might ask for something different. To endure and sustain, conservation has to be grounded in law, but it also has to be grounded in the hearts and minds and everyday choices of diverse people. That means those who love nature need to fully engage people, all people. Our work needs to be as relational as it is transactional. Now, I know this picture of a population that doesn't care isn't necessarily Maine's picture right now. And Tim's absolutely right. I've read the polls too. Support for Land for Maine's Future is strong, and it crosses lines of class and ideology. But I hope you appreciate what a unique asset this is, something not ever to be taken for granted, something upon which to build an economy and a community perhaps not seen before in our country. I truly believe you have that opportunity. And there are many conservation groups right now that are actively creating Conservation 2.0. It's a regional land trust in California collaborating with farm workers and farm owners to create housing and protect farmland. In Massachusetts, it's a land trust merging with the citywide Urban Gardening Association to better serve the full range of experiences of the land. In New Mexico, it's a land trust operating a mobile slaughtering unit to help expand the farm economy. In Arizona, it's a national conservation organization building a charter school to help keep multi-generational Hispanic ranchers on the land. And in Rhode Island, it's a watershed group making critical low-interest loans to start up businesses who seek to get people out on a river. And in Oregon, it's conservationists buying health insurance for loggers to help them reduce their economic dependence on cutting trees. The language and skills of Conservation 1.0 have been technical, financial, legal, and its goals have been grounded in science and that very important act of counting dollars and acres. And I imagine all of us, I know I am, are deeply indebted to that period of conservation for giving us our whole system of parks, but also for exporting that idea of conservation to the rest of the world. So Conservation 2.0 builds on all that was achieved, takes in what we've learned back about conservation from the rest of the world, and it's predominantly concerned with how we as a people and a community relate to that land and also relate to one another. So Conservation 2.0 is about conserving land with a whole new set of tools, not limited to easements and even ownership of land. And it has the potential to conserve that land on a much larger scale, going from landscape scale to culture scale. And the skills needed in this practice, and these are different. I was not trained in these. They include flexibility, listening, political agility, dialogue across divides, cultural competency. But the opportunities for success are just enormous. Greater public understanding, much deeper collaborations, legislative victories, and much, much more. And for a few, I've heard in their voices the professional thrill and accomplishment that comes from not only saving a piece of land, but helping to create change in a community, helping to create a land ethic in a community. And that's actually fulfilling Aldo Leopold's dream for conservation. So for those groups who are breaking those new trails, there are some similar experiences that I want to share with you. Many are debating the impact of $1 spent on protecting land versus the impact of $1 spent on education and getting people on that land. Some are transitioning their stewardship programs into public education programs. Those who are staffing their new education programs are beginning to recognize and see more ways beyond science and scenery that people want to engage in the land. Art, music, food, children's health, spirituality. And as every conservation group engages the community more deeply, they hit a wall. They hit a glass door. They face the difficult challenge of navigating difference. In Maine, as we said, it's not overwhelmingly about race, is it? It's more about class and the divides between old-timers and newcomers, the lack of shared language, even a shared way of saying town names sometimes. It's true in Vermont, too. Feelings of not being seen and impressions on both sides of being left out. This is really, really hard work requiring new skills, but I want to offer to you that it is the work of our time. And it takes endurance and the willingness to be vulnerable and to make mistakes, but there are conservation groups who are emerging from all of that effort stronger, more connected, more resilient, with far, far bigger bases of support. Here are some examples from Maine and Canton. On the Androscoggin River, it simply wasn't in the community's DNA to connect with the river they felt was dead. Jonathan Labonte knows this because he grew up there alongside the river in the same apartment that his dad grew up in. But the Androscoggin Land Trust was given an opportunity through FERC relicensing to try something new. They joined the Chamber of Commerce and started a process of listening to the community about how they did connect to the river and how they'd like to connect to that river in the future. Jonathan describes that process of building respect and understanding by first making clear that conservationists weren't about to impose their vision from a few on the many. A plan came forth that earned unanimous support and money of two rural towns. But not everyone from the Land Trust was comfortable with how the land would be used. Jonathan says, we had the obligation to meet people where they are. I've seen, he says, the level of conversation about what's best for the land improve and improve. He says, give the community a voice, arm people with good information, and respect that they will make better and better decisions for the land. End quote. In Damariscotta, Stephen Huffnagel and his colleagues have always asked themselves how they're adding value to a community. But even they were surprised when the idea of creating a skating rink was proposed for some of their land. How's that land conservation? Some asked. But that question wasn't debated for a second by the community, where everyone seemed to get the value. Stephen says it was classic stone soup experience. The gas folks donated propane, Bowdoin lent skates, and our local contractor leveled the ground. It was just plain fun, he says, pushing a ball downhill instead of always pushing it uphill. I had dozens of other people, many I didn't know, doing the cheerleading for us. Stephen says, we are unapologetic about our diffuse strategies to protect the river. So creating a skating rink has made it possible for Damariscotta River Association to engage far more people, more deeply in the community. There's a positive buzz in town that's counterpoint to the controversy over taking land off the tax rolls. But creating a skating rink was not merely a strategy to get other goals accomplished. It's given them a platform and a credibility to talk about what matters most. What those communities can do together to create a future where both ecology and economy matter. Or on Deer Isle, there's always been one place where kids learn where to swim and where their parents cooled off on a hot summer day. When that place went up for sale, it was a no-brainer for Mike Little that Island Heritage Trust ought to protect it. Mike told me, we see our job as helping to protect community assets, which don't always start with biodiversity. Sometimes you have to start with how people make good lives, he said. Mike told me, we are part of this community, and this was a good way to show it. And there's been a major shift in attitude about us, especially from the folks who've lived here the longest. By responding to what this community asked for and really needed, that set a table for us to talk together about freshwater issues, about the future, even about climate change. More is possible than ever before, end quote. In each case, they're embracing a new story of conservation that's not solely about science or even really about the appropriate care of Maine's resources, but more fundamentally about the creation of meaning, the making of lives that are worth living. And when we do this, not only are far, far more people going to be drawn to conservation, but conservation itself is going to become stronger and more enduring. My generation of conservation has been grounded in business and science and numbers, and that's been great. But the challenges today are not merely legal or financial or scientific. They are also cultural and social. And on this, I hope to be clear. It doesn't mean better managing the community toward your goals. That's not what those three groups did. It's about bravely engaging the community, meeting them where they are, engaging what's different from you in your community, with the utmost trust that this relationship is going to lead to conservation you had never thought of. Spread your mission to places you never considered it could go, even change you to better fit that mission. It's about being open to the game-changing quality of the next 25 years in Maine. I've come to believe much more in Dr. King's advice. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, then go together. And even though you here in this room are brilliant and strong, and I know you are not brilliant and strong enough to do the work of conservation in isolation of other movements and other human need here in Maine. We can do this together. MOFCA, Coastal Enterprises, Four Directions Native American Development Corporation, Environmental Health Strategy Center, Good Shepherd Food Bank, Habitat for Humanity, Maine Affordable Housing Network, Children's Alliance, Maine Speak Out, the SALT Institute, to name just a few. They care deeply about land and biodiversity too. But to be honest, They don't see themselves as conservationists. They don't see themselves in the story of conservationists, and many of you likely don't see yourselves in their story. And that's a problem. And it's one reason why the important work of conservation can be criticized for being elitist and the providence of just a few. We don't really know each other's work, and that hurts. So I hope conservation can meet Mainers where they are and with what they want and need. A skating rink, a place to learn how to swim, a relationship with the river, a forest that will support deer and jobs, and a community where a young Mainer can return to her family and expect to be able to afford to live there. I believe land conservation, as it can be practiced in Maine, has a big role to play in all of that. Conservation can become a positive force for community building when it focuses on creating that culture and economy around the needs of nature and people. When it demonstrates that it values all diversity, plants and animals for sure, but human as well. And Maine may be our nation's best crucible to prove this possible. And you know this better than I do. Maine gave us the Back to the Land movement in the 1970s with Helen and her husband Scott, though they moved here from Vermont, I might add. They did their best work in Vermont, and Maine gets all the credit. But thousands and thousands of 20-somethings who moved to Maine to seek a new relationship with the land because of these two. Some of these folks are undoubtedly in the room right now. They're 60-somethings and 70-somethings who gave us conservation commissions and land trusts. And I feel a huge debt of gratitude to each of them. What will come next from Maine that responds to this moment in time? The nearings, some of you will remember, were not just about land and organics and simple living. They were also fundamentally about social and economic justice. Scott said, and I'm quoting, "Realize that you are part of and responsible to all that goes on around you." In 1950, Scott wrote, "It takes initiative, it takes gumption, it takes a certain amount of daring to leave the rut and cut out a new path." End quote. I think in Maine you are cutting out that new path. You have hundreds of examples of positive and possible futures, from all the local VOR efforts to the thousands of solar panels that are springing up like mushrooms, to the health of our natural habitats here and working forests, to the appropriate scale of your democracy, to the possibility that every Mainer, especially a recent immigrant, can have a relationship to this land. So the opportunity for success in Maine in 2050 is deeply rooted here and loyal to see these forests and rivers and estuaries, even though they may just have arrived. What you do and can do, provide people with a relationship to land and nature, I so firmly believe this, it is still medicine for what most ails our culture. Our healthy relationship to land is the mean by which we all generate and recreate and renew all the big transcendent values, beauty and responsibility, love. Even that, for sure, patriotism, in its original meaning, was love of land. And there are many, many thousands of Mainers, many millions of Americans who love the land and may now be or forever have been at the edges of town or mainstream culture. There by choice or not, but who feel strangers in their own community, left out of economic progress for whatever reason. Folks who were here first or came last. People who work with their hands in a world that works with their heads, or folks simply on the losing end of a demographic trend. It's not that I hope to do conservation just for them, but I will not do conservation that forgets them. To do so would be to forget our fathers. Your most important work over the next 25 years may be just to offer a new story about what nature means to the full range of people. And I don't think we can do this by demanding a change in attitudes, but only by inspiring it. And what inspires Mainers isn't adequately addressed here in numbers, in facts and data and 5-year plans, and I was raised in that world. And I don't have a lot of proof, but all I can remind you is that Dr. Martin Luther King did not say, "I have a plan," right? I mean, come on, what did he say? He did, indeed. Indeed. I was 8 or 10 when I first heard it and took it in. You hear it again.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
What will be the equivalent in our own humble and no less important ways of offering an "I have a dream" speech for land and biodiversity and community here in Maine? What new dream needs to take shape? And equally important, who needs to be alongside you to create this dream? Can all Mainers see themselves in it? You know, I don't know the answers to that, but I do know what the answers sound like. Acadia, Agamenticus, Androscoggin, Bascahegan, Chesuncook, Blue Hill, Cape Rozier, Egamogan Reach, Damariscotta, Endless Lake Merry Meeting, Kennebec, Kennebunk, Loon Echo, Pemaquid, Penobscot, Mahoosic, Moxie, Medimemps, Sebago, Sheepscot, St. John. Thank you for all you do.